See.
All right, everybody, we are going to get started. Welcome. I am Kat Duncan. I'm the Director of Innovation at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. And today we have one of our fellows this year, Deborah. She is going to talk a little bit about her project, ask questions. We are encouraging people to interact, make comments, ask questions. So please feel free to either raise your hand, which will make your name flash for us, or you can write in the Q&A box or the chat box, and wherever you contact us, we will be able to interact with you. All right, so I will hand it over to Deborah, and just let me know if you need anything throughout, but I will be here to support.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody, or if it's morning where you are. Again, as Kat said, my name is Deborah Dwyer, and I am a RJI fellow this year. Very excited about that. I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. There we go. Just let me know if we can't see it. I'll put it in presenter mode. There we go.
Yeah,
looks okay, Kat?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm excited to see so many people here. Whoops. Especially with everything going on. I know newsrooms are crazy busy right now, but to me it speaks to the importance of the project. So we'll just jump right in. I know sometimes there is some confusion over what we mean by unpublishing, because actually the term is used for a lot of different things, especially in newsrooms, because unpublishing in some respects is not a new phenomenon, especially if libel or, you know, some of the legal reasons that we've unpublished in the past are used, you know, that term is used. So here is just kind of the traditional definition of unpublishing, right? So it's pretty generic, but I'm using a working definition today, and I'll be interested in your feedback on this. But the working definition that I've come up with is, this is the act of deleting factual content. So again, this is accurate content, at least when it was published, that's been previously published online, in response to an external request. So these are requests that are coming from outside the newsroom, not necessarily outside the news organization, unfortunately. We can talk about that, but outside of the newsroom. So again, not internal reasons to unpublish. And typically these are prompted by personal motivations, such as someone is embarrassed by something that was published about them, or privacy concerns. We'll get into some of that as well. And it's important to remember, and this is something that I have seen more and more as I've done research on this topic and spoken to more newsrooms, is we're not just talking about text anymore, right? We have a tendency to think about newspapers and online papers or online news organizations dealing with this, but more and more broadcast organizations are dealing with it, radio, TV, as well as I think podcasts are getting ready to get hit quite a bit with this as well. And when you get into broadcast, things get much stickier when you start talking about captions and video and audio and those kind of things. One of the interesting things, though, is that the way journalists see it is not always that simple, right? This is something that I hear quite a bit, the refrain of, you know, unpublishing really isn't accurately reflecting what people are asking us to do. They're actually asking us to censor or rewrite history because we are that first draft of history. Well, sorry. Okay, there we go. Yeah. And we know this is a concern for a lot of editors, and this comes out of one of the studies I did, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But we see that these are just a few of the concerns that editors have around ethical issues and relationships with the audience, right? So accuracy being a big one, of course, but also journalistic credibility comes up quite a bit, as well as audience trust. How do we do this if we're going to do it at all? How do we do this in a way that maintains not only professionalism and industry standards and credibility, but also audience trust and buy-in into the credibility of what we're doing? There's been a ton of industry dialogue about this, some from news organizations, some from industry organizations like Neiman Lab or Columbia Journalism Review. Many people have suggested some standard guidelines. I would argue that those are having a hard time sticking right now because we have not gotten to the root of some of the core questions about unpublishing, but again, we'll get to that, I'm sure, later. And this is becoming a major problem because we're not just seeing like, oh, we're getting peppered with these requests and we're not exactly sure how to handle them. We're now seeing it get much more serious, right? Kathy English, who was the public editor of the Toronto Star for over a decade, and she's been very involved in unpublishing research, we'll get to that in a minute too, wrote a story actually, and then On Media Ethics picked it up, about one of their reporters being offered a bribe to unpublish a story that was actually over something relatively silly. It was not a crime or anything like that. And then this is one story that I've seen from a local journalist who actually quit the profession because he felt like, especially when it comes to lower level crime reporting, that we were seeing that it was being dictated more by page views and how much of the news hole we had to fill that day, that kind of thing. And he felt like, it was an ethical issue, and he actually left the profession. We've actually seen, this isn't in the presentation, but we've also seen public relations practitioners start talking about erasure as a form of reputation management, which is very concerning. And of course, this has made it to the courtroom. I didn't get into much of that. That can get very sticky, but with the right to be forgotten in the EU, the drastic rise in concerns about online privacy, of course, we're starting to see this get to be a bigger issue that extends much further out than news organizations. One of the first industry reports that came out was based on a 2009 survey that, again, Kathy English, when she was the public editor at the Toronto Star, actually worked with the APME and the ASNE to do this survey and then to publish a report that provided some guidelines. One of the issues, if you've seen any of these types of reports or suggestions, is they're relatively vague. Some of them are definitely helpful, but I've also found in my research that they haven't gained a ton of traction, especially some of the ones that are more transparent to readers. So quickly, I'll just talk about some of my research and then we'll get to the RJI project, but this will set it up some. So I did qualitative interviews with 12 editors or newsroom leaders, including public editors, managing editors, station managers, that kind of thing, standards for editorial policy, with everybody from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation to NPR to smaller regional newspapers and the like. So I made sure to include all mediums. So those qualitative interviews helped me then follow up with a journalist survey that was partly to follow up also on the 2009 survey that Kathy English did. Then I did a 2019 public poll. It was a crowdsourced poll, which then has led to my dissertation work, which is a national survey that I just conducted. And it was, this is the first national survey of US adults about unpublishing. And then I'm also doing a review industry discourse that's been published going back to the first one I've been able to find is about 1995 about the issue to see what the industry is saying about this and where we're headed. So I wanted to point out a couple of things, again, based in my research that are kind of interesting that will help set up as well kind of where we're going with this project. So we saw some discrepancies, right? 34% of organizations said we absolutely never unpublish. And mind you, this is based on about 109 responses, and this was promoted through the APME and ASNE again through their membership, and it's roughly about the number 2 that Kathy English had respond to her survey in 2009. So limited survey, but we saw, you know, about a third say we never unpublish, but then 80% said, well, it's okay in certain circumstances. I don't know about your news organizations. I do have it on pretty good authority that even organizations that say that they don't unpublish often do. They're not transparent about it necessarily. Some of them even go so far as to track down articles in, say, LexisNexis with some of the archive organizations, track them down and get them to be unpublished there. There we go. Another discrepancy, 65% of people say that it's not okay to have inconsistent policies across the industry, and a few less support standardization across the industry, but then only 24% think that that's actually likely. One thing that I hear a lot is these are all case-by-case situations. We have to adjudicate them as such. I would push back on that a little bit. I do think that there are some issues and some circumstances that we could standardize, but I also understand the specifics of each situation. I have sat in on several committee meetings with the news organization where I used to work, and I understand how tricky they can get. A little bit on policies. In 2009, the Kathy English report found that less than 50% had policies in place. I found, thank goodness, that there were more than that. There was about 80%, a little more than 80%, excuse me. One of the problems was only about half of those were in writing, and only 30% of respondents said that they actually adhered to the policy 100%. And again, transparency seemed to be an issue. The policy wasn't shared externally, hardly at all. And staff awareness, this fascinated me. We saw that less than a third said that staff were made aware as needed. Typically, these were not published in any sort of employee handbook or newsroom policy documents. IT awareness, 30% were unsure if IT were aware of their policy, and that becomes a problem when IT can easily unpublish content without the newsroom's knowledge. And I have several anecdotes about that, which are pretty disturbing, often after the newsroom has said no to someone's request. Also, very interesting is that only 4% had any kind of standard tracking system, which you'll hear me talk about in a little bit. I think that will be really important to this RJI project. And then a committee being established to review unpublishing requests. I think 5 people in my sample said that they had one of those established. They're becoming more popular, and they are almost always suggested, including in the 2009 report, as best practice, just so one person isn't kind of playing God. But again, we had not seen, at least in 2017, that those had taken root. This is another interesting part, and you'll see, you know, there's discrepancies with what editors say ought to be happening and necessarily what is. 64% said it's very important for readers to know that content's been removed. A few less, but still more than half, said that readers ought to know why. But then 4% actually said that they are noting the removal for readers. Best practice, again, is to keep up the HTML, the website link, and note the removal. Something was removed here with limited information, and that's not happening. Some editor support for alternatives or editorial changes were interesting. Publishing the names of minors. Again, we're sensitive, right, to vulnerable populations. That was more popular. Removing and report if expungement was proven was, had limited support. It's interesting, though, because that is much of what I hear from editors that they're actually are receiving requests about, and that they typically will unpublish. And then withholding names until someone is formally charged was even less supported. Okay, so after there was a 2019 Radiolab episode that I participated in about, they called it, unfortunately, the right to be forgotten, which is not exactly forgotten, right? It's the right to be obscured in the EU, which we can talk about. But I want to do a public poll. So this was a crowdsourced poll. It's not socially scientific. It was published and promoted on social media. But I did want to get, in advance of my dissertation, some information from the public about what they thought might be appropriate to be unpublished. And you see here, safety came out on top, with stalking. The actual situation given to them in the poll was that a woman's address was published in a news article, and she had requested that it be removed because she was being stalked. Marijuana arrests, low-level marijuana arrests because someone's searching for a job and the like, are pretty well supported across the board. I've also seen that in the preliminary data analysis that I've done over my dissertation. Employment, this was a teacher that called to ask that a community block party photo be unpublished because she had a drink in her hand and it violated her school's policy. And then an adult calling because his name had been published as part of an article that was written about a teen runaway situation. He was the teen runaway. And you see there's a little bit less support for that, but still more than half. Dropping down some criminal charges, child abuse charge being dropped for a woman, 56%. Expungement of an indecent exposure arrest, a little less. That was fascinating to me, typically because sex crimes, in my experience, are not as supported, even if, again, other crimes might be given more clout as far as being considered to be unpublished. Prom night bomb threat by a high schooler, you see, again, a little less support. And then source remorse, which Kathy English kind of coined that term, someone who voluntarily contributed to an article or a photo or something like that and is now either embarrassed by what was said or feel like it's going to cause them some repercussions in their present life. And this was a situation where a man participated in a feature on gay marriage, but now does not identify as a homosexual, and so he asked that that article be removed. So support for different editorial practices that could be alternatives to unpublishing. And again, this is the public poll. You see anonymizing identifying information was highly supported. Adding an editor's note for some context, for example, on top of an article, maybe charges were dropped or lessened for someone. Adding that editor's note was well supported. And then sunsetting articles or arrest reports after a certain period of time. I found this very interesting. There was about, mixed support and a lack of support for that. And in my research, there has been significant, really overwhelming response from editors that they do not support this, although we are continuing to see a trend where mugshot galleries, especially of news organizations, are being either unpublished totally and done away with, or the reports are being sunsetted In other words, they disappear out of search results after a certain period of time, 6 months, a year, whatever. So what is the RJI Fellowship? My project is really meant to utilize some of the research I've done, and by no means am I the only researcher who looks at this, but I have done more research than most. But the RJI Fellowship is really looking at this in kind of 3 parts. I'm establishing an advisory board of industry experts, people who look at very specific aspects of this, including legal issues such as the right to be forgotten in the EU, its impact on the US press, which is more significant than some people realize, and the legal threats that it challenges us with. So that advisory board is helping shape the project, and they will give input on the actual tools that are being developed. That second piece is I'm partnering with several newsrooms to develop tools and resources to combat some of editors' pain points about unpublishing. Those have yet to be 100% defined, but I will show you some of the ideas and some of the things that I've talked over so far with the newsrooms that have signed up to participate. And then I'll be creating a fully functioning website at unpublishingthenews.com that will include these tools that other news organizations could hopefully implement or adapt and implement for their needs, as well as corralling industry research and dialogue about the topic, court cases as they come down the pike, that kind of thing, as well as, I hope, a password protected forum where editors and journalists can go and talk to one another about these issues. I know that that's one of the problems that I've heard is you may, be able to pick up the phone and call one friend in the industry or something, but there's not a lot of group dialogue or mass dialogue, excuse me, about this, because a lot of times the information is sensitive that you're talking about. So on the advisory board, and this is to date, we've still got some invitations outstanding, but you'll see Kathy English again. She's kind of the mother of unpublishing research in the industry. Alan Sunderland participated in one of my the qualitative interviews when he was with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. He's now the executive director of the Organization of News Ombudsmen and Standards Editors. Jasmine McNeely, who is a professor at the University of Florida, who writes extensively on privacy and the right to be forgotten's impact here, as well as she's proposed an ethical framework for making unpublishing decisions, although it's very high level. Amy Gaja, she really is the preeminent scholar here in the US about the EU's right to be forgotten and its impact and challenges to the press here, even though some people will argue that the First Amendment protects us. Amy makes a great case for why that's not necessarily enough. Joy Mayer, I'm sorry, that's a typo, it's M-A-Y-E-R. She is the director of Trusting News, which also was an RJI project and does a lot of work about practices that newsrooms can implement that increase trust with audiences. And then Sydney Smith, who's the managing editor of iMedia Ethics. Of everyone who writes about unpublishing, actually, Sydney is one of the most prolific. It's been a pet project of hers. We've talked on many occasions, and out of, I can tell you, about 300 articles that I'm analyzing for that part of my dissertation, Sydney wrote 64 of them, so she's well versed in the issue. So partnering newsrooms so far, the Chattanooga Times Free Press is on board. For those of you who might know her, Allison Gerber is the editor there. I actually worked at the Times Free Press, the Chattanooga Times before the papers merged, as a journalist for a short period of time. And then my last job, actually, before I came back to get my PhD, was their marketing director. But I worked very closely with the newsroom on a lot of journalistic projects. And actually, that's where my interest in publishing originally originated because they were struggling with this issue significantly. And in fact, Allison just published a column that after I think they started their mugshot gallery page, which was called Right to Know in 2010. They've actually just discontinued it last week. And she wrote a very eloquent column as to why. The Columbia Missourian here is going to partner with me, and we've got some good ideas about where we might go with that. They actually have some pretty good unpublishing policies in place, but it's really due to their pre-publication practices, which I would argue are a big issue, or a big piece of this that we often forget. We kind of look at the tail instead of what could we do on the front end, right, that might mitigate some of the reasons that we have to unpublish on the back end. And then we've got some feelers out for a broadcast outlet, always interested in talking to anybody who might be willing to participate in the project, trying to keep it somewhat manageable. And then if we see we have the bandwidth, I'd love to include a student news organization, frankly, because a lot of unpublishing requests originate there. In fact, one of the court cases, the first court cases in the US originated at a student news organization. And so lastly, whoops. There we go. So what are some of the projects that we're specifically looking at developing with newsrooms? One of the first ones is a standardized request process. One of the things, and actually this is something that I'm talking specifically to the Chattanooga Times Free Press about, and this would be a standardized form, leveraging some technology here for us, so we can truly standardize the request process that will keep requests, number one, in a streamlined flow. Typically these requests come in hither and yon, right, in a news organization, everybody from the front desk to the editor's desk to, you know, a particular reporter to IT to legal. And so standardizing that process is really important, including this will help us hopefully get some good information on the front end, so there is not as much back and forth with each request. And this could include, for example, being able to upload some documents. If someone is saying, hey, my arrest was, or my case was expunged, and I'd like you to consider that. Newsrooms, of course, are strapped these days. Nobody's got the time to chase down this kind of content, especially if it was 10 years ago and no reporter who was there even, you know, is still around. Standardizing this and getting a lot of that documentation up front will really help. It will also help with the second issue, which is tracking requests and how they are adjudicated. One of the things, again, that I was fascinated by my research is that how few newsrooms actually track this. And if we want to be able to claim that we are unpublishing, if you choose to unpublish, with any consistency, it's really important that we track what kind of requests have come in and how we have decided them, so we can indicate not only for ourselves as a reminder, but also if we needed to demonstrate that externally, that we are being somewhat consistent, right, in how we are adjudicating, especially similar cases. Audience transparency is another issue. One of the things that I've talked about with a couple of the news organizations is creating a transparency report. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the, for example, the Google transparency report in the EU. You can Google it and find it. And it provides some high-level detail about how many requests come in, how many they grant, the types of requests they are, in other words, high-level, you know, reasoning for the request, and what kind of link it is. For example, if it is a link that's being obscured off of a news website, then there's a category for that to indicate how much of this is news traffic. And again, we can get into the right to be forgotten if need be, if anybody's more interested in that. But that's just one way we could be more transparent. Again, some standardized language of editor's notes or information that is retained at a URL where information is removed. Those kind of issues are the things that we could tackle with audience transparency. Also, a few organizations have started doing polls of their audiences to ask, how do you think we ought to adjudicate cases like this? And that's another project that we could undertake with a newsroom to do an entire communication campaign and see what we get out of that and how we might want to incorporate that into some sort of policy development. And then, as I mentioned, pre-publication policies are really a big piece of this. So when do you publish a child's name? When do you publish an arrest, and what types of arrests do you publish? Do you have a sunsetting policy? How clear are your informed consent practices, and how much training do your reporters get on that to ensure that the people that they speak with have a clear understanding that this information likely could live in perpetuity online. I've been surprised at the people, especially I spoke to an education reporter who said, I've just always published children's names until I had one come back and ask me to remove it. And actually the news organization denied the request. And it caused her a lot of anguish, personal anguish. But she said, I never really got any significant training about informed consent. Maybe I should have pushed that harder. Of course, you don't want to push it so hard that a source won't speak to you, but maybe there are some things that we can do there as well. So those pre-publication policies, I think, are going to be really important. Won't keep requests coming in from expungements and the like, but it could shore off some of the issues, especially with publication of children's names and that kind of thing. So I know that was a lot of information, but I will stop there, and hopefully we can have a good discussion.
So you do have a couple questions. The first one says, thank you for the great presentation so far. A quick question regarding IT backend and tracking. What is the consensus around simply de-indexing to remove links from the host website and search results, but leave the story online?
Yep, that is something, definitely, it's a great question. That is something that some organizations are doing. I didn't find that it was a substantial number that I have spoken to, which is fascinating. And typically it's also interesting because people, again, going back to the definition of unpublishing, right? Some people don't think of that as unpublishing. One reason I think we need another word for this, but that's a whole nother story, right? But yeah, I mean, de-indexing is definitely an option. One of the things I like to remind people when they say, oh, this is like the right to be forgotten. Number one, the right to be forgotten is a misnomer because you are not forgotten. The actual right is a right to obscurity, which means that we just make it more difficult for someone to find the information about you, right? So it is a de-indexing of the link, yet the information stays online, just like, I hope it's Bernat, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, is suggesting. Here in the US, when somebody makes an unpublishing request, they're actually talking about deleting. So it's actually more significant and more dangerous in a lot of ways to press credibility, I think, than the right to be forgotten is actually in practice. So yes, some people are de-indexing. I think it's a good option when appropriate. Again, and I'm saying all this, I think it's important for news organizations to clearly understand if you're going to unpublish or not. Again, I think if you say you're not going to unpublish, you have to stand by that. And so far, I have seen not many organizations who actually do that consistently. There will be some case, especially cases of threats of suicide and the like, where they do unpublish even though they say they don't. So yes, I do think de-indexing is a great idea for those who choose to do this. I also think it's going to take more coordination with IT. A lot of people that I spoke with weren't fully aware of like what IT's capabilities were or exactly what they were doing or could do. So I think it's more discussion about that. How are you going to make that either a consistent practice? When is it appropriate? Of course, just like any other standard policy that you put into place.
All right. Next question is, should the standards for publishing student work created for class and published on a college website be different than the standard for professionals?
That's a great topic, and it gets into something that I've noticed, which is a lot of times student publications or news organizations really draw a harder line in the sand than professional organizations do. And I think that partly is due to, we teach them, of course, right, in college that journalists are fighting for the truth and they are custodians of the public record and they are the first draft of history. And so it kind of makes sense, right, that they have this very black and white attitude that, no, we never do that. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of these requests come from, because people do stupid things while they're in college sometimes, and then they get out, they're looking for a job. They don't want that to follow them around. So I don't know, specifically, your question is specifically about created for class. I wonder what kind of issues. I'd be curious in talking to you about what kind of issues you see arising there. Again, because so many of these have to do with crime and the like, I wouldn't imagine a lot of that's coming out of class, but definitely student publications as a whole, yes, there's quite a bit coming out of there. And should they be held to a different standard? I mean, that's a huge ethical question, right? I don't know that if we want to hold student journalists to a lot of the same ethical standards and teach them to be the journalists of the future, right? Going out into the industry. I don't know that that inconsistent practices necessarily make sense, or a big distinction between the two types of news organizations.
All right. So there, a very specific question. What do you think about someone requesting and unpublishing an article about their criminal charge holding indecent images of a child on the basis that they served their sentence and their life has moved on? The person is claiming the right to be forgotten.
Right. So this is, I mean, this is a super common type question, right? In fact, that Radiolab episode that I mentioned, their sympathetic character at the end of it was a man who had actually been caught basically charged with indecent exposure several times, which the sex cases are always fascinating to me, because, you know, culturally we do kind of put them in a different category, right? Can someone request that? Absolutely they can. Will some people unpublish it? Yeah, they will. One of the things that I remind people is, and I've had to stop myself from doing this, is it's very easy to use the example of, oh, a kid that, you know, was streaking across the football field in college and now he wants to get into law school, right? That's a very number one, a privileged type of scenario. Excuse me, but it's also typically not the ones that editors are really wrestling with. And I invite you to see, for the Pandora's box that could occur, if you go look at the transparency report that I was talking about at the EU, you know, for the EU, the Google report, you might be surprised at some of the top categories that get unpublished. Some of them are violent crime, sexual assault, murder in one case. I know in one presentation I gave, there was a situation where they had unpublished a homicide. The person had been deemed I'm trying to remember what the exact word was, but it was like criminally not negligent, but they were convicted of the homicide. I believe it was due to mental illness. And a lot of those will give you the reasoning, and it might say time served. You know, sometimes we have this thought that, again, you know, the time that has passed somehow, okay, these people have, you know, have served their debt or whatever. One of the things that I'll say about that is a different way to think about newsworthiness, ongoing newsworthiness, because that's the problem, right? We don't know the future value of information. It might seem insignificant right now, but if that person were to run for office later on, and was a public figure, would we potentially have a different standard than if we were making the, you know, the decision right now when the person's 20 years old or whatever. And also on the sex cases, again, sometimes we talk about newsworthiness as if it's this big blanket thing that and a story or a photo or whatever it is has to be important to like the public as a whole. And one of the examples I use is if you were a new mother and you were looking for a nanny and a woman had applied and she seemed wonderful, and you're going to do a quick search for her on the internet before you hire her just to make sure that you don't see anything out of whack, and you don't find anything, but come to find out she was charged with child abuse 5 years ago. Maybe the charges weren't followed through on, right? Maybe they were dropped. Charges can be dropped for a lot of reasons. But I would argue that that information is highly newsworthy to that mother. So I think we have to reconsider sometimes. It's really easy to do the false equivalency of someone who's right in front of you upset about an issue, excuse me, that they are saying causes them specific harm. And then, you know, trying to compare that to like this general newsworthiness concept, right? So I think somehow crystallizing the idea of newsworthiness on the back end and the value of information for the public is really important to do.
All right, next question. People who contact our college news websites often assume that unpublishing immediately removes a story or portfolio from Google search results, but we know that isn't the case. What is your advice for explaining this technical issue to readers?
Yeah, this is a fascinating one because also I'll answer that question, but another major one is a lot of times people don't understand that they can call in, say their charges were reduced, right? And they want you to update the content or write another article. Well, that often will bump the story back up, right? Maybe it re-timestamps it, that kind of issue. And so actually lawyers are becoming keen to this, and now often they will say, you know, like when they send a letter to the newsroom, we don't want you to update the story or write the story. And I actually have a situation where I spoke to one editor who said he got in a conundrum with this because someone contacted them. The case had been, the charges had been reduced. They actually did the legwork for the person to find it out. But once he explained to the person who was making the request what was going to happen as far as Google search results, they then said, well, I don't want you to do it. So then he said he felt an ethical dilemma that he now knows that he has inaccurate information on his website and he has the information to update it. And, you know, what does he do? And ultimately he updated the information, even though it was, you know, at the I don't know, despair of the person who originally made the request. So that gets really tricky. Most people don't understand this. In fact, I'll be honest, I've spoken to many editors who don't understand how this works. When I ask them, hey, does this read timestamp this and it pop back up or whatever, they don't always know. And, you know, talking about a portfolio from Google search results, Google search, yes, is an issue if it's been picked up by a LexisNexis, somebody like that, that's a major problem. And also just social media, right? Anybody can share something or take a screenshot of it. And I have a really good quote from one editor that said, we can do what we can, but the internet's an echo chamber, and a lot of times there's some echo left in the room. And so this also keeps some editors from wanting to unpublish at all, just because they're like, hey, there's nothing we can do. That information's out there somewhere. You can take that approach if you want to. It may be out there. It just depends on how far you're willing to go to scrub it. Right. Some people will contact Google, but I haven't met a lot of organizations that are willing to go to those kind of links to make sure that something's erased from the net.
All right. That seems to be all the questions for now.
Okay. Well, I'd love to invite the participants to share their pain points. Again, if you are in a newsroom somewhere and you're experiencing these kind of issues, what kind of issues are you experiencing and what would help? I mean, that's the point of this fellowship, of course, is, I'm here to serve newsrooms and to help build tools that hopefully will not only help the newsroom that I partner with, but also can be shared industry-wide. So I'd love to hear some thoughts on what could help you in absence of very strict policies, which I do think we can probably come again to some policies, but I also think some of these tools will help us get there and maybe need to be in place before we jump to policy. But anyway, I'd open it up to thoughts and questions and suggestions on that. Oh, somebody needs help, surely. Well, I'm actually curious. Several people have asked questions about student organizations. And so I'd be curious about how many of you are involved in student journalism organizations. And I actually would also point you to the Student Press Law Center that I did not specifically mention them earlier, but they have done some really good work on Unpublishing. And have some good best practices for student journalists. They're always available as well, of course, to consult with. And so please make sure if you're a student journalism organization that you do check out the Student Press Law Center's resources. If you just Google them, a lot of it'll pop up. Is there a best practice list for college paper advisors on when to unpublish? Again, Janine, I would look at the Student Press Law Center. They have some really good practices for student journalists. And then someone said, let's see, Marcella, is there a guidance on unpublishing practices, some gold standards? Again, quite a few organizations have suggested best practices. There is no, if you're looking for a gold standard, I'm not exactly sure what that would be, except to say the 2009 report that Kathy English did, and again, I can provide that link or you can Google it. It's Kathy English. It was created with the Associated Press Managing Editors, now the News Guild. And Kathy was with the Toronto Star when she did it, and the Canadian Association of Journalists are the ones who actually published the report. It's very robust. It has some good particular guidelines in it, but it also has a standard script you could use when somebody requests something be unpublished and the like. So I would suggest looking at that. I'm trying to think through what we do about stories published by other news orders. The Texas Tribune gives away all our stories for free, right? So if we change up a story, would we try to track down all the, right? That is a major issue. And I just don't know that you can, right? Corey, I don't know how you would do that, especially if you're giving it away for free. Do you even know who all's using it? I think that that could be a really good discussion with the people who do use your content, maybe publishing some editorials about it and the like. I don't know if you have any kind of agreement with people who do share your story or that you give your articles to. But again, there's typically a lot less you can do once it's left your newsroom. You know, I will tell you that the Internet Archive I had found will pretty much accept anybody's unpublishing request. And so there are ways that people can, you know, get some things scrubbed even without your help. Yeah, so you know, and one of the suggestions that a lot of people do too for people who are concerned about this is, oh, well, create more content of your, you know, for yourself online, start a blog, that kind of thing, so your information, that information that you don't like, gets crammed down, maybe on the third page of Google, right? But again, that's somewhat of a privileged suggestion. Not everybody's going to have the capability or the agency to do that. Yeah, so let's see, Kurt, pain point. Yeah, I've heard of that, where students sometimes will contact you and ask about having portfolio pieces removed. You know, that's really difficult when the actual reporter asks you. I'm not real sure how to answer that one. That one's a conundrum, right? In some ways, I feel like it's their work, you know. So again, it's going to have to be the student organization's decision. But in some ways, it is their work, right? In other ways, they produced it in the service of an organization. So yeah, I mean, again, these days, typically students who are coming out of colleges or universities do have the agency and the means to create additional content. You know, but yeah, that's a conundrum. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I do know of cases where student organizations have taken down portfolios, or maybe de-index them, that kind of thing, kept the link up. So if the student wants to get to it or share it with somebody, they can, but it's not necessarily out there for everybody to see. Looks like Ramel has an idea. Maybe putting some sort of disclaimer at the end of stories that remind readers that more information may come to light as the situation unfolds. Yes, this might help in case of a news organization doesn't follow up on a story. Very good idea. A lot of times we do see that with like developing stories, right? A shooting occurs and we'll see this is a developing story, check back for updates. I don't know, Ramel, if you're thinking like that would, you know, you would put that disclaimer on every story. You'd have to do it just about, right, on every crime report for sure. Excuse me. But your last sentence also raises a good point, because you said this might help in case a news organization doesn't follow up on a story. I have spoken to many news organizations. In fact, one of the ones that's going to participate in the project, hopefully, is having this discussion right now about their crime reporting policies. And that is, do they even report on especially crime-related events that they have no intention of seeing through? Either they're more trivial, maybe they would have published it before because it was unique, that kind of thing, but they have no intention of following it through the court process. There are many organizations who are now thinking about not publishing those in the first place. You'd have to decide for yourself if that's the right way to go. There are arguments on both sides of that debate for sure. Some people feel like that's weakening the watchdog function. But it is an option for some people that they're saying they're just not going to report on lower level crimes anymore. Other organizations, including broadcast organizations, are just changing their policies around the use of mugshots in particular. Maybe until someone is formally charged, they're not going to use their actual mugshot because those can be picked up so easily, and especially in today's digital age, we've got mugshot extortion websites that charge people exorbitant fees to have their mugshots removed from a website. And typically they own more than one. And typically once you pay them $300 or $400, if not more, to remove your mugshot from one site, it starts popping up on their other sites. And it's kind of a game of financial whack-a-mole, right, to clear up your reputation. Those are all great, great questions.
All right. Well, we've got a few minutes left. If anyone has any last questions, or Deb, if you'd like to provide your contact information, I put the Twitter and the stories, but if you want to tell people how they can contact you if they want to talk more.
Yeah, sure. I'll put right here, I'll type right here, my Twitter, Deborah L. Dwyer. I also just created, so there's not a lot of content out there yet, but there will be, Pub the News on Twitter. And then you can reach me at unpublishingthenews@gmail.com. And I am happy to speak to anybody about this topic. I have a ton of information. As you can imagine, I talk about it all day, but would love to help you with whatever specifically that you're wrestling with. And again, it will create a lot of value for this project because I want to make sure whatever we do is in service to news organizations that need the help.
Looks like you have one more question.
I'm curious what justifications were used by the 8% of editors who would not publish a stock. Oh, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you were talking about one of the last slides that I showed that was actually from a public poll. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what you're talking about, that members of the public would support, except for 8%. Unpublishing a stalking person's address. I'll tell you an interesting story about that, though, is I have spoken to 3 or 4 news organizations that have had threats from someone of suicide, typically after multiple requests to unpublish something that's causing them distress, and the news organization saying no multiple times, and the person comes back and is threatening suicide. And at that case, even if you have said that you will not unpublish, obviously it's a huge personal dilemma, practical dilemma, ethical dilemma, professional dilemma as to what you do. I have been surprised that news organizations have taken the stance, every single one that I've spoken to, and again, it's 3 or 4, where they have required the person's mental health practitioner to provide a letter stating that this is actually the case, right? To document that there's some mental illness going on and there is enough distress here that the person truly is suicidal. So, you know, that's a drastic step. But then again, when you think about it, every one of those editors very quickly said, well, what if everybody does that? Everybody could claim that, and then we'd have to unpublish everything. So, you know, news organizations are really in a conundrum when it comes to this. Again, you don't know the future value of the information, but you also don't always know the specific harms that can come to an individual, or if you do unpublish in one case because there is significant harm to an individual, how many other situations are out there that you'll never know about? And that's one of the things that we see with crime, especially, is I always ask is, you know, the white attorney in town who knows the publisher going to be able to get his mugshot unpublished, whereas how many other people have been arrested for that same thing that their mugshot is going to live on in perpetuity. So we've really got to start also thinking, especially in this day and age and with all the dialogue that's going on in society right now, what are we doing to maintain equity here and consistency in our decisions?
All right, well, it looks like we're about out of time. So the contact information is in the chat box. Thank you everyone for joining us. We did record the conversation, so we'll be posting it on our YouTube. If anybody wants to email us, we can send you a link. And thank you so much. And we look forward to you guys being a part of this project in the future and more discussions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Send any questions, comments, suggestions. I'd love to talk to you about it.
All right, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.